The Sunday school lesson for November 24th, 2024 is God's Promised Presence, Psalm 139, verses 1 through 12. Welcome, viewers and subscribers to my channel, Read With Me. I am Audrey. If you are new here, please know that this is an audio reading of the lesson with intermittent commentary. If you have not subscribed to this channel thus far, please consider doing so. And remember, please subscribe, like, share, and comment. Thank you for all that you do to help this channel grow one viewer and one subscriber at a time. Verses 1 through 3. For the director of music of David, a psalm. You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. This verse introduces a central theme of the chapter, which is further emphasized by its near repetition in the conclusion of this psalm. God's complete knowledge, often referred to as his omniscience, is the attribute that encompasses his infinite awareness and understanding of everything that has ever happened, is happening, or will happen. He is entirely aware of all things, but David did not set out to write a doctrine of God's knowledge. David assumed God's omniscience as fact and did not make an argument to convince others. David's intention was not to teach about God's infallible, complete knowledge, but instead to marvel at it in awe and perhaps even in fear. We might think of this verse as beginning a courtroom drama, with the Lord trying the evidence of David's character. You have searched me and you know me. The Hebrew word translated searched is the same expression employed to describe a cross-examination in a judicial context. God is the judge who has meticulously scrutinized and comprehensively understood all the evidence required to judge the heart's motivation. In verse 2, the psalmist enjoys the terms sit and rise to convey God's knowledge of an individual's entire day. The two extremes point to God's total knowledge. Nothing is left out. The literary device of naming opposite ends of a spectrum to indicate something in between is called merism. Jesus' knowledge of people's inner lives is one marker of his divinity recorded in the Gospels. In verse 3, the psalmist emphasizes that God possesses knowledge of both public and private aspects of one's life, from their travels, my going out, to their resting, lying down. The Hebrew term translated discern in context is an image of sifting grains to separate the grain from the chaff. This suggests God's metaphorically sifting David's life to separate chaff from wheat. A helpful analogy to clarify this notion involves likening the process to a gemologist who scatters an array of gemstones across a table, enabling the individual examination of each spectrum for quality. Verses 4 through 6. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Verse 4 states that in human communication, the potential for misinterpretation looms large. This is perhaps especially apparent in text-based media when we realize how much of comprehension comes down to nonverbal cues, such as tone and body language. Even when face-to-face, myriad factors can create misunderstandings no matter how carefully words are selected, not least the words themselves, which can have wide variations in meaning and are highly context dependent. Given the perils of communicating even when both parties are acting truthfully, The risk of being deceived by a bad actor is always high. In stark contrast, God possesses an unparalleled ability to comprehend every word, even when it is mere thought or intention. No context or body language confuses his understanding. In verse 5a, here David's focus shifts from the pure fact of God's knowledge to the action he takes with this knowledge. Him in is multifaceted, indicating an act of confinement, binding, or encircling. This can have positive or negative implications depending on context. Most frequently, it denotes the plight of a city besieged by hostile forces. In one instance, however, the word is used by the beloved's friends. If she is a door, we will enclose her with panels of cedar. A similar concept, though with a different word entirely, is used to describe God's protection of Job. Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? The evidence suggests David was experiencing God's presence behind and before as a hindrance of some kind. In 5b, the metaphor of God's hand might shed some light on the context of him in. Although God is an immaterial being and does not possess physical appendages such as hands or feet, the writers of Scripture were constrained by the limitations of human language in their attempts to depict God in a way that would resonate with their audience. There is precedent for desiring God to turn his attention to someone else, as communicated here with the metaphor of his hand. For instance, after eating the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, the last thing Adam and Eve desired was an audience with the Lord. Job asked God to withdraw his hand, and Ezekiel described God as striking his hands together to punish Judah. Later, John the Baptist uses a winnowing metaphor to describe Jesus' hand at work in judgment. We should not discount that David could have experienced God's attention as being too intense for the man to bear. This psalm has no confession of sin, and in fact, it asserts David's blamelessness. But one wonders if God's nearness was bringing to light what David would have preferred to leave in darkness. We might think of the time between his transgressions with Bathsheba and her husband and Nathan's confrontation. David seemed to be living in denial of his sin. This or a similar incident could account for wanting some space from God's knowledge and presence. Far from experiencing God's presence as an unmitigated blessing, David seems at least to struggle with the experience, if not to outright struggle against it. Verses 7 through 8. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. Verse 7 marks the beginning of Psalm 139's second stanza. This pair of questions can be read as an escape attempt or as an oblique acknowledgement of sin. Praise and adoration for God's constant presence, or some mixture of these. If the above reading of David's having found God's presence to be heavy is correct, then the first sense is most likely in view. David might have found God answering the king's questions with some questions of his own. Who can hide in secret places so that I cannot see them, declares the Lord. Do not I feel heaven and earth? But even after fleeing from God, Jonah found relief in God's ability to save even from the deep, considered to be the furthest place from God's heaven. So we might assume that, though David felt God's scrutiny too much, in the end, this would be a relief compared to a reality in which God was absent. The portrayal of God's omnipresence, presence everywhere, within this psalm is unique in the context of the ancient Near East. Most, if not all, other deities in the region were considered to have a limited geographic sphere of influence. They were not expected to be present other than in the places where they reigned. This highlights a key difference between those so called gods and the Lord. He reigns over and is present in all places, not to mention the fact that the regional gods are entirely fictional to begin with. This understanding substantiates that David's writings stem from a deeply personal and intimate understanding of God rather than mere appropriation of general religious concepts from nearby cultures. In verse 8, the word if, found 5 times in the English translation of Psalm 139, verses 8 through 11, indicates the hypothetical nature of the declarations that follow. The first two of those verses give examples of places where David could not physically go to flee from God's presence. The heavens are obviously a no go, as that is God's home. And David couldn't get there on foot in any case. In ancient Israel's understanding of the world, multiple levels of heavens existed above the earth. This suggests that the contrast of heaven with the depths in another merism, where a combination of two contrasting parts refer to the whole. In this case, considering that the place of the dead was believed to be under the earth, these two places are as far from one another as can. David's presence in either would not hide him from God. Verses 9 through 10. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. In verse 9, in contrast to the vertical imagery of the previous verse, David shifts to horizontal imagery. Wings of the dawn is a poetic reference to sunrise, which happens in the direction east. The sea refers to the Mediterranean Sea, which lay to the west of Israel. Taken together, we see another merism as David describes going as far as east as possible and as far west as was known. Hence, the depicted imagery expresses God's abundance presence, extending as far as the distance between the east and the west. What David instinctively knew, the prophet Jonah would find out the hard way when he was told to go east to Nineveh, but tried to flee by going west to Tarshish. In verse 10, having established the hypothetical situations of the previous two verses, David identified two comforting actions linked to God's omnipresence. First, David could be guided by the hand of God regardless of David's location. This assurance was grounded in the understanding that one is never in a place where God cannot provide guidance. Second, David asserted that one cannot be beyond the reach of God's protection and salvation, as exemplified by the phrase, right hand will hold me fast. This assurance brought David comfort, who had in mind his adversaries who sought to do him harm. Verses 11 through 12. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. In 11a, David introduces another conditional statement. The darkness here is figurative, metamorphical. Darkness characterizes the time when thieves are prone to operate. Thus, this if statement fits David's previous questions about attempted concealment. In 11b through 12, these conclusions all speak to the futility of trying to hide anything from God. Even opposites such as darkness and light make no difference to God's knowledge of David's physical and spiritual locations and status. The metaphor of God's illuminating presence is continued in the New Testament and is ascribed to Jesus Christ. Thank you so very much for listening. Join me soon for the next audio reading of the Sunday School lesson with intermittent commentary. Stay safe and may God bless.